Okay, David, we're going to take it away. Well, greetings and welcome everyone to this very special event featuring IU President Michael McRobbie and the vital work that he has done and continues to do on the topic of election security. My name's Scott Shackelford, and I have the honor of being the Cybersecurity Risk Management Program Chair here at IU Bloomington, as well as the Executive Director of the Ostrom Workshop and an Associate Professor of Business Law and Ethics at the Kelley School of Business. Today's event is being co-sponsored by the Ostrom Workshop and IU's College of Arts and Sciences Democracy Themester. And a very special thanks go to Professor Regina Smith and Tracy B for their tireless efforts in organizing all of these Themester events, including our election security mini-series. As a reminder, this mini-series kicked off just a few weeks ago with a special election security panel that we convened, featuring a range of IU and external experts from the US and Europe, including Professor Phil Minzer and Vaughn Welch, Leisha Pash, as well as Special Agent Michael Alford. If you missed it, it's available on the workshop's YouTube channel, which we'll be linking to shortly in the chat box. There we focused on a wide range of threats to our democratic integrity, including disinformation, deepfakes, and digital repression. Today, our focus is more tightly centered on the need to safeguard our voting infrastructure. We know there will be plenty of questions, but given the format, we ask that you use the question and answer feature to post your questions for President McRobbie at any point during the hour, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible during the Q&A portion, which I'll be moderating. First, though, here to help us launch this discussion and properly introduce our very distinguished speaker is Professor Bria Perry, IU's Associate Vice Provost for Social Sciences and a Professor of Sociology. Over to you, Bria.
Hi, thank you so much, Scott. Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this critically important and timely event of Securing the Vote with IU President Michael McRobbie. The event is sponsored by the Ostrom Workshop's program on cybersecurity and internet governance, which brings together an interdisciplinary group of scholars and other stakeholders with the goal of making meaningful progress towards sustainable internet governance and towards cyber equity and peace. As Scott mentioned, the event is also part of IU's Themester program, which is a fabulous program that we have here at IU. The theme this year is democracy. And so we've all been challenged this semester to engage in interdisciplinary debate around really critical issues like voter suppression, the rise of populism, political polarization, and election fraud and misinformation. I'm really very honored to introduce President Michael A. McRobbie to kick off this event. President McRobbie joined IU in 1997 as the university's first vice president for information technology and chief information officer. He became later the 18th president of Indiana University in 2007. And since that time, President McRobbie has led the university through a number of really important changes and challenges. And these include major expansion in the size, quality, and most importantly, the diversity of the IU student body. He's created 10 new schools, and he launched the Bicentennial Campaign, which is the largest fundraising campaign in IU's history, which has raised almost $4 billion, that's billion with a B, to support students, the university, and the state. In terms of his research, President McRobbie holds faculty appointments in computer science, philosophy, cognitive science, informatics, and computer technology. I'm only affiliated with one department, so I have a lot to live up to there. I got to get working. And he's been a really active researcher in information technology and logic during his esteemed career. Probably most relevant to the event that brings us together today, he recently co-chaired the National Academy of Science's Committee on the Future of Voting, which oversaw the publication of a comprehensive report called Securing the Vote, Protecting American Democracy. This report outlines findings and recommendations that provide the United States with really a blueprint for an election system that is accessible, reliable, verifiable, and secure. The committee's work began shortly after the 2016 election, at which point they realized that the most significant threat to American elections was not necessarily related to faulty or outdated technologies, but came from internal and external efforts to undermine the credibility of election results. And one of the key foci of this report was election cybersecurity. On the eve of the 2020 presidential election, it seems clear that the issues addressed in this report and the ones that will be addressed in today's event are more significant and urgent than ever. One might wonder if you could add clairvoyant to President McRobbie's list of proficiencies. So in closing this introduction, I want to leave you with a quote from the report that seems especially prescient, and that is, quote, "Cybersecurity is a never-ending challenge." And with that, I give you Michael McRobbie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bree. I appreciate the kind introduction. Let me just bring the slides up here, and hopefully everybody can see those okay. So I've got a slide deck here that I'll go through that derives from the report that we submitted a couple of years ago. I'll talk about the background to that, but I'll talk about, in essence, what the key recommendations of the report were, and then some follow-up issues that come out of that. I think it goes without saying that an electoral system, a system of elections that the citizens of a country can have confidence in, is probably one of the absolute bulwarks of democracy, one of the fundamental building blocks of democracy. If there is widespread skepticism about results and about the way in which the elections are held and their outcomes and so on, that doesn't just have an effect on the election, the specific election itself and the people who are elected, but it even more dangerously starts to undermine the fundamentals of a democratic system. So there in some ways, as an element of our democracy, there is probably nothing more important in many ways than the system by which we elect people at all levels in the country to represent us. So let me make some other comments first. In the United States, there are an enormous number of positions that elections are held for at all levels, obviously the federal level, the state and local level. And there's more than 500,000 of these throughout the country. But, and this is a critical thing really to understand, and I'll come to this in a couple of more slides, but the system, our general system of elections is extremely decentralized. And consequently that makes it vulnerable to internal and external threats, including really appropriate levels of investment. Where that can't be done, you then suffer from having aging equipment, being decentralized with highly variable levels of expertise. You become vulnerable to sophisticated external actors. And then at the same time, there are growing expectations from the public that elections should be more accessible, in a whole variety of ways, more convenient and more secure. So that was the sort of background. And unlike other countries, as I said, the system in the United States is highly decentralized. Much of it, though not far from all of it, is handled at the state levels, but there's a wide level of autonomy to the individual components of a state at the county and city level and so on as well. And unlike many other countries, there is no nationwide election authority in the United States. Now, as I'm sure nobody knows, I was originally from Australia, and in Australia there is one central election commission that basically determines the format of all elections throughout Australia. Also is involved in the drawing of boundaries too. So the whole issue of of gerrymandering really doesn't happen either. This was established by a bipartisan vote now, I think maybe 35 years ago in Australia, and has, I think, functioned very, very well. And many other countries have central election authorities, but there is no equivalent in the United States. However, the Constitution does leave it to individual states, though it leaves it to individual states to run and regulate elections. Congress may make regulations that override state regulations in the conduct of federal contests. It has shown itself to be reluctant to do so, but it may be that we see in future years, simply because of the widespread perception of the vulnerability of elections at the state and county level, that we may see Congress get more involved in making regulations about the fundamentals of how elections should be held as well. Now, voting is as I said, is a complicated process. It involves multiple levels of government, and one of the things that really became abundantly clear in the process of the report we put together was that you have an enormous range of skills and capabilities among the various personnel who run various elections at various levels throughout the country. Some are enormously sophisticated, some are barely trained at all, and that brings with it all the appropriate problems. There's no standards with respect to the various electronic systems that are involved either. So you've got a wide variety of different electronic systems too, again, with the issues that involves. In November of 2016, the last general election, there were nationwide, this obviously will vary slightly this year, or this election, there were nearly 180,000 individual voting precincts throughout the country, and nearly 120,000 physical polling places, and more than 8,500 early voting locations in the days leading up to the 2016 election. So, as I said, much of that is decentralized, and there's no overall authority responsible for all of that. It really is handled at the state and county and other levels in the country. So, and of course they are a massive undertaking, and in many ways it's been a credit to all those tens of thousands, if not, well, hundreds of thousands of hardworking individuals who have made, probably millions of individuals who have made elections able to work in the past. Though I think, as we all know, significant cracks are starting to appear in the system. So the 2016 presidential election was as the slide says, a watershed moment in the history of elections. It exposed technical operational challenges that it was believed required the immediate attention of state and local governments, and federal government researchers and the American public as well. And these issues really highlighted the need for a careful re-examination of the conduct of elections in this country, and demonstrated a need to carefully consider trade-offs with respect to access and cybersecurity. I think we were starting to see a sort of a stampede towards voting via the internet. Thankfully, the steam's gone out of that in many ways, but that was probably reaching a crescendo before and around the time of the last election. So the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, this kind of America's most prestigious academic academies, decided to establish a committee to investigate the future of voting, in particular, to address the issue of accessible, reliable, verifiable voting technologies. This was done very promptly. I got a call, I think, within 2 weeks of the 2016 election from the academies, asking me to co-chair it with my colleague Lee Bollinger, the president of Columbia University. I'm a computer scientist. He's a lawyer, so that they wanted to have the balance there, and the committee was basically in place before the end of 2016. That's how quickly the National Academies moved. The National Academies does a lot of studies like this. In fact, it was established partly to be the source of advice in these areas to the federal government from the time of President Lincoln, and has functioned that way ever since. The reports are called consensus reports, and the goal is to bring a group of experts together who deliberate on a matter, carry out hearings in public, and then compile a report from that in turn is released and made public to government and others as well. So the committee was established to make recommendations of ways to, as the slide says, to marshal science and technology to create more resilient and adaptive election systems that are accessible, reliable, verifiable, and secure. These reports normally are sponsored by external entities. This report was sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation in New York and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and is a committee made up of lawyers, social scientists, computer scientists, and election officials. This is the composition of the committee. I won't go through every member of it, but I'll make just a couple of comments about some of the members. There's some extremely distinguished social scientists, computer scientists on this committee, and a number of election officials who have play a major role with very large precincts. Dana, County of Travis in Texas is a very large electorate there. Neil Kelly, the Orange County in California, is the size of a small country, and so Neil is got an electorate with millions of voters in it, and consequently he really has a large and sophisticated staff that has to handle all the issues involved with voting in Orange County, and he and Dana are two very visionary, very highly competent election officials, and their contributions to our committee were enormous. Kevin Kennedy was a previous election official as well in Wisconsin. I'll mention just one other member of the committee, Ron Rivest. Ron won the Turing, or co-won the Turing Prize some years ago, which is like the Nobel Prize in computer science, as people probably know. And everybody knows of RSA encryption. Ron is the R in RSA. So one of the world's most eminent cryptographers and cryptomathematicians too. So it was a great privilege to work with such an incredibly good collection of and such distinguished people as well. And so that was the committee. We as I said, the charge was to document the state of play and to examine the challenges, evaluate advances. I mentioned that before, and then offer recommendations. So we reviewed extensive background material, very large amounts of background material, and we held 5 multi-day open meetings with probably around 100 people presented, gave testimony to our committee. We met mainly in Washington, but also in Colorado, and we had a wide variety of people of considerable seniority from across the federal government, state governments, and so on. For example, we had General Michael Hayden, former director of the NSA, director of the CIA, give testimony to our committee, and that was indicative of the level of testimony that we had. And all of that testimony and our internal deliberations were distilled into this report. This is the photo of the report itself. It's available from the National Academies, either online or in hard copy and so on. And we issued this in September of 2018 after first briefing the staff of various congressional committees about it. Now, it contains 46 recommendations written in careful recommendation ease, And rather than presenting the recommendations in their exact format, what I've done is boil it down to basically the 6 core issues on which we recommended. Some of these issues, there were multiple recommendations that really comprised one recommendation, but for the sake of this presentation, I've tried to boil it down to the essence of what we recommended in our report. The report has got, by the way, a very large amount of attention. It is still referred to even today. It's been referred to a lot in the last couple of months, in particular leading up to this election. And both myself and President Bollinger of Columbia, we've co-authored numerous op-eds for various papers and other places around the country, effectively on issues arising out of our report. So here are the key recommendations, and I'm going to drill down and say a little about each of these as well. The first, somewhat ironically, for a committee that was brought together to address technology issues, our emphatic #1 recommendation is to only use human readable paper ballots. It was the unanimous view of the committee, and I think of almost all of the people who testified, that any form of electronic voting that does not involve a paper ballot as a record of that vote is vulnerable, and you cannot guarantee the ultimate security of that device. We had people who testified about various ingenious attempts to create such systems, and were able to demonstrate repeatedly how these could be compromised in multiple ways. Even something that is disconnected from the internet can be compromised through malicious software that can be introduced through updates that take place via thumb drives and so on as well. So all of that is addressed to some extent in the report, but of course is addressed also by reference to a vast literature out there in this area as well. Secondly, and I'll explain what these are in a minute. Secondly, we recommended the use of what are called RLAs, risk limiting audits, and I'll say a word about those in a minute too. Thirdly, again, somewhat ironically, for a committee with the remit that we had, we emphatically recommended that the internet should not be used for the return of marked ballots, for similar reasons to what I just gave in one. We did not believe, certainly based on the technology that exists now, that it is possible to provide a complete ironclad guarantee of the security of marked ballots returned on the internet. Fourthly, and very sort of opposite given the news yesterday, the whole issue of voter registration databases and their security is critical. Fifthly is just funding. There were attempts to pass bills in Congress for more funding for election security. These were not completely successful. We'll see after this election whether they'll be revisited and whether there's any opportunity for more federal action in this area as well. And then finally, and this again is relevant to some of the issues that are emerging in this particular election we're coming up to, is to provide a means for voters to easily check whether a mail-in ballot has been both sent, received, and accepted as well. And there's been progress on that area. So let me just drill down with a slide or two on each of these. Firstly, human readable paper ballots. Specifically, we recommended that these be marked by hand or by a machine using a ballot marking device. There is an argument for needing these minimally for some disabled people, but the reasons of convenience and so on, there may be an argument for them as well. But at the end of the day, what we came down strongly recommending, unanimously recommending, was that ballots be paper and be marked by hand. Because, as I said, there simply is no guarantee that any non-paper based system is secure. Now, these may be counted by hand, or in particular by a machine using an optical scanner, and this is fairly common. And I'll come to why that's less of an issue, even though, of course, those numbers could be compromised. But the recounts, and this is the critical thing, the recounts and the audits should be conducted by human inspection of the human readable portion of the paper ballots. So even though you may count by an optical scanner, if there has to be a recount, that has to be done with the paper ballots, not by retabulating the optical scanner results. And we recommended that voting machines that did not provide this capability should be removed from service as soon as possible. They are dangerous in terms of being able to be compromised. Now, most states use paper ballots, though some states still use what are called DREs, direct recording electronic systems, without what are called VVPATs, voter verified paper audit trails, in some precincts. But nationwide, still, some 14% of voters continue to use paperless DREs, including, unfortunately, in this state. So this is the argument for paper ballots. They simply are the safest and most secure way to vote. Now, risk limited audits. These rely on a lot of sophisticated mathematics, some of which was in fact done by Ron Rivest and our committee, but others were involved as well. But the basic idea is very simple. What you do is if a question is raised about the validity of a result, you simply take a sample, a completely random sample of the paper ballots that were submitted, and then tabulate those and use that to check the result. The number that you choose depends on the level of certainty that you want or confidence you want in the result. So if you want 95% confidence that the result of declared result in election is correct, that may, out of say 50,000 votes, may require you to take 2,000 randomly chosen. It's a relatively small number, surprisingly small number, that you need statistically to do this. Now, when you think about it, the limiting case for risk limiting audits, if you want 100% certainty, you count everything. So really, it's just a way of taking a statistical random sample to give yourself confidence up to a certain level. Now, implementing this is a little harder than it sounds, because you need to be certain that the way this is done is completely random, and there are some complications about that. But nevertheless, it is in statute in Colorado. In fact, in Colorado we met with the Colorado state election officials and had an outstanding presentation from them about how they're implementing it and so on. And you'll see from this map, a number of other states are looking at using RLAs or investigating, including Indiana. It's a great compliment to our state that we are at least looking at our RLAs. And we recommended that they should be used for all federal and state election contests and for local contests where feasible. We believe that if there was a concerted effort, that RLAs could be put in place for all congressional, Senate, and presidential votes for the next election, 2024. But it'll take investment, it'll take training, it'll take a lot of work, and of course that has to be done state by state. But these are gaining a lot of interest from people around the country, because it is a good way. It is an excellent way of being able to verify the outcome of an election if there's a challenge. I mean, if it's a 10% win to one party or the other, one candidate or the other, it's unlikely anybody's going to want to challenge it. But if it's within 1%, some states actually mandate you have to have a recount, and so it may be that this is a way of being able to do that in lieu of doing a full recount. So that's RLAs. The internet should not be used for the return of marked ballots, or one of our major recommendations. And again, I don't think I really have to dwell on this, except that based on our review of all the proposed ways of doing this, we simply did not believe there's any way in which this can be done with complete 100% guarantee of security. Whether it will be done so, whether this will be done in the future, whether it be possible to do this is unclear. Some of our committee, I think, would argue it probably isn't. Some would argue maybe it could be, but at the moment, it was a consensus report, and our view was that the internet should not be used for the return of marked ballots. So this was a pretty strong recommendation against the whole idea of using the internet to vote. Voter registration database as well. I mean, just yesterday, the Director of National Intelligence and the FBI Director held a press conference. Actually, was going on last night while I was looking at these slides. Said that the intelligence community believes that Iranian and Russian operatives have obtained voter record information. I don't believe, I can confess I haven't been able to read all the press on this or anything else on this this morning, but I think it's unclear whether they believe any registration databases have been compromised, but some have been before, and I expect the expectation is that probably some have been, and that maybe I'm missing, and maybe I've missed something in the news and that's already been confirmed, but it certainly is an area that people have great suspicion about, and so on. So the registration database is one of the crown jewels of an election system. It has to be safeguarded with the strongest possible security measures. Again, we understand that they're not foolproof, but if one gives that major attention and puts in place methods of safeguarding the voter registration database, that in itself makes it harder to compromise. And then looking at both the physical security for those, but also ensuring that there are paper backups. One of the ways it would be possible for a foreign actor or a malicious actor to compromise or to disrupt elections would simply be to knock out the computer that has the registration database, the voter registration database on it. Hence, people, when they come to vote, they've got no record to check whether or not you're qualified to vote. So having paper available provides a backup if the electronic systems go off the air. And it's worth considering here, and I'm quoting General Hayden, and he said this publicly, so I can quote him, that he said he believed that some of the malicious foreign actors who were involved in issues with the last election, 2016, that some of them don't particularly care who wins. Their concern is more disrupting and sowing doubt about the validity and integrity of the election system itself, as I said before, one of the fundamental pillars of democracy. So even just disruption by taking out of action such an essential part of an electoral process as voter registration databases is a way of doing that as well. And of course, and this is an area where there has been significant improvements. Department of Homeland Security is really ramped up its efforts in this area, but states should require election administrators to report compromises and so on, and those relationships I think have been significantly expanded and built and what have you since the last election as well. So this is an area that really is vital and needs major attention. Congressional funding. I mean, I won't go over this in detail except to simply say that that the only way one is going to bring the whole electoral system of the country thought of as a composite is going to be through federal investment to completely get rid of DREs, to provide uniform technology that would handle voter registration databases, appropriate standards of training, and so on. The bigger, like I mentioned, Orange County, the bigger precincts like Orange County are able to do this, but most of them aren't that big and a lot smaller and need help. And of course, the use of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, to develop security standards, uniform security standards that everybody uses, which doesn't exist at the moment, and which is maybe mandated to be used too, is another one of the areas that we recommended. NIST is very very good at this in this area. The work they've done, their standards on cybersecurity are now regularly adopted in business and industry, and this is the area where NIST has got a major role to play as well. And then finally, mail-in ballots. The election coming up is expected to be the largest vote by mail election in American history. I think the number's already a record of people who have submitted ballots. So we recommended, and there has been movement on this, that there be work done on providing voters with the ability to easily check whether their ballot has been sent, been received and accepted, and so on. And this is something those of us who use FedEx and UPS and so on are already familiar with, because it exists in that context. And systems that do this now exist in a number of states. Again, this is something one would want to see done uniformly with uniform levels of security and so on. But this is very important in that one hears a criticism of mail-in ballots that they're never received, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if you've got an electronic guarantee of that it has been received of the same level that UPS and FedEx provide, then that provides a much greater level of confidence, I think, in voting by mail as well. And of course, this has been driven by the coronavirus pandemic at the moment too. I'll say just a couple of words about Indiana. Indiana, unfortunately, is a state that has a very mixed collection of electoral systems in the various counties in the state. This map shows direct recording electronic voting where it takes place. That's in the red, and that's without the voter verifiable paper audit trail (VPAT) for all voters. And you can see the majority of the state is of that kind. Some of the DREs have VPAT, which is the way at least of having a paper record of the vote that you lodged on the DRE. Some do provide right at the bottom hand-marked paper ballots and BMDs for accessibility, which is the case in this county, and hand-marked paper ballots, DREs for accessibility without VPATs, which is not a good thing, are used in some counties as well. Now, this is an area I know that Secretary Lawson has really worked very hard on, and the General Assembly passed a law requiring that all counties move to voting systems that require a paper trail, whether that's by doing it directly or indirectly with a ballot marking device by 2030. I mean, this is obviously of some concern, because if you don't include the election we're about to have, up to and including 2030, there are going to be five federal elections and a host of other elections at the state and other levels as well. And this is an area where I think it would be possible to move more quickly. I do understand the impact of the coronavirus on the state's budget as well, but the 54% of who's using paperless voting machines spread across, and that totals 60 of our 92 counties, and so we have one of the more vulnerable systems, voting systems in the country. We're one of only 8 states that now use in full part DREs. Now, the Center for American Progress in 2018 gave us an F in this regard, but that was based on outdated data. But I mean, I think it does say something about the perception of our electoral system. So more funding is needed to speed our transition, Indiana's transition away from paperless DREs. As I said, I'm very sympathetic to the budget position the state is in, but this is a fundamental building block of democracy, and really, I think requires maybe greater attention than it's had. The state did appropriate $6 million to help or start work on this, though Secretary Lawson asked for $75 million to do this comprehensively. And this relatively slow action has led to litigation, and probably will continue that way, unfortunately. And this is obviously driven by people who are concerned about the vulnerability of paperless systems, and as they should be. I mean, that's the whole key recommendation of our report, and so on. So I'm hoping that the state will be able to revisit this issue, especially after this election, and depending on how that goes, and then look at whether this process could be accelerated going forward. So that's it. That's really a summary of the issues that we dealt with on in our committee, in our report, National Academies report. It is on. This matter is obviously going to be ongoing. There has been talk about reconvening us for further work after this particular election is over. But these issues remain of enormous importance, and also remain, I think, in many cases unresolved. That is, there's a lot that still needs to be done, though there has been commendable progress in some areas. And with that, Scott, I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, President McRobbie. And I know everyone from home will virtually join me in thanking you for the excellent presentation. And we do have several questions that have already come in. And just as a reminder, please feel free to post, and we'll get to as many as we can. But to kick us off, as you noted, relatively few nations, vote over the internet, with Estonia, for example, being an outlier. Others that used to use electronic voting machines, like Germany, are going back to paper. And I was wondering, could you speak briefly to, why it's so hard to vote securely online, and relatedly, why having a paper trail is so important to build confidence in the outcome of an election? In particular, reflecting on why mail-in ballots are so much more of a secure option than e-voting.
Well, I think that the reason that paperless voting is problematic is simply because, as you know, Scott, there is simply no guarantee of an absolutely secure system that can't be compromised in some way. There very ingenious ideas are being proposed, very ingenious technologies, at least based on the work that we did with our committee. All were shown to be compromisable in some way, in practice, or at least in principle. And I think until that can be resolved, paper remains the only way of voting. The only guarantee. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be issues with paper, and there can be, but it's vastly harder to do it at scale. I mean, you want to change an election outcome electronically if someone's just using DREs by 1,000. Just a couple of lines of code to do that if you've compromised the system. You want to do it by hand, that's really hard, really hard. Especially given the kinds of physical security that exist for ballots. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but the cases of that happening are very small and very modest as well. With respect to mail-in ballots, they're again, you're submitting a paper ballot, and I know there's a lot of different issues that have been swirling around. It seems that hardly a day goes by when there isn't some court decision about all that. In some state about stopping what they're doing or allowing it to happen and so on. But the fundamental issue there really is to be assured that your ballot has been received and accepted and that is put in the pool to be counted, either in advance or what have you. That is, maybe doesn't give people 100% confidence, but is likely to give most people very high confidence that process is working. If you drop your ballot in the mail and you've got no other guarantee that it's been received, you just hope that it's been received, you can rightly have some concerns about whether it got lost or something. It's unlikely. Mail works pretty well. But with a FedEx UPS type system, and they do exist already, you've got an ironclad guarantee that that's been received and accepted. Excellent. I mean, it could be rejected, but then you'd want the system to be able to then inform you that it's been rejected, and for whatever reason, and you've got to do it again or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, thank you very much. And there's quite a few questions coming in, which is great to see. So, several of them relate to, the recent news, for example, that you referenced that the DNI came out with recently about the Iranian efforts to target U.S. voters using databases that, by some reports at least, may even be available for purchase. And so I was wondering if you could maybe reflect a little bit on how the U.S. could better deter these sorts of influence operations, including kind of to Julie's question there about the role that, frankly, social media firms should play as part of this process, not only to safeguard, our voting information infrastructure, but in this case, the information we all rely on to, pick the candidates and the policies that we prefer to support.
Well, sort of ideally, and I realize this is somewhat idealistic, but ideally, for example, having NIST specify a set of security standards for voter registration databases. Now, the Electoral Assistance Commission has done a lot of work in this area as well. So the two of them working together, saying, okay, if you've got a voter registration database, here are the recommendations or specifications about the kind of technology you use, the way in which you back it up, the physical layers of security, obviously the electronic layers of security, and so on. It's not an ironclad guarantee, but it's going to be a lot stronger guarantee of the security of that database than really leaving it up to individual states and what have you to do it according to whatever way they think is appropriate. Now, our experience is that most of the people election officials are always, hungering to get help and standards and so on out there, but they're really, until you get a strongly promulgated series of standards here, I think it's not going to be, it's always going to be a vulnerability. And of course, you've got that issue that I raised before, that when you've got such an incredibly distributed system, the weakest precinct is going to be at the mercy of some giant intelligence agency in some foreign country. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Thank you very much for that as well. And you also referenced this a little bit in your presentation, but I know this is, a subject a bit near and dear to your heart, but how can democracies, frankly, including the US and Australia, as well as our NATO partners, work more closely together on combating, election threats targeting our voting infrastructure? Do you have any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, a good way to do it is to learn from each other's mistakes. I can't remember the exact. Maybe there's someone in the audience who remembers this or knows this area better than me, and you may remember this. But in my country, my birth, one of the states, I think, came up with an internet voting system that they thought was pretty foolproof. And one of the people who testified to our committee, an academic from an American university, and his team were able to sort of crack it in a day. And so on. I can't remember the exact details. You probably remember that case and so on. So yeah, there's experience there that is worth sharing. I mean, I think the biggest story is don't even try doing it, but sharing information about these missteps minimally is a positive thing to do. The systems are very different. I mean, the system in Australia is hugely different to the system here. Voting is compulsory, for example. It takes all electoral boundaries are fixed by a federal independent, bipartisan, or not bipartisan, independent federal commission. Voting takes place on Saturdays and so on. So, I mean, all these things really affect an election. There are uniform rules for the vote by mail and so on. That's true of other countries. But in the general area, what are the best practices that work? What are the missteps that one can learn from? I, in spite of having spent a couple of years now, nearly 4 years, in working in this area on the side, I certainly don't regard myself as an expert, but I'm sure the practitioners and election officials have their conferences and mechanisms by which they get together and do exactly that.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. Yeah. And just because you just referenced it, Mike was also asking, my guess is this is beyond the bounds of the report, but did you give any thought to other recommendations to promote access to voting, including, longer periods for voting before the election itself? So early voting, as well as even moving the election day to Saturday, as you said, happens in Australia already. I guess that's beyond the bounds.
It was by and large beyond the bounds. We did discuss these things, but it was beyond the bounds really of what we were doing. Although and a lot of the issues about voter suppression and so on that are very controversial, and I know that there are people with passionate views on these issues. We really didn't touch on those. We were really focused on the security and integrity of the system.
Absolutely, which we all have a stake in. And as another participant was asking, what can you do? What can the average citizen do to help get involved in this process to help protect the vote?
Well, I know, and maybe it's too late. I confess I don't know the timing on this. I know that that because of COVID, the pandemic, that there has been difficulty. This may have been resolved. I just don't know. There at least had been earlier difficulty in getting enough people to man the voting stations. I think especially younger people voting volunteering to work those stations would be a great help. And I know some of our students have volunteered to do exactly that. It's extremely commendable. It can be very helpful to do that. But I think just learning about how the system works and being able to, and there is disinformation out there, and some of it is being maliciously sown about the electoral system. People understanding actually how it works, and I think if people are in counties with just DREs, I think politely raising the question about the when will these be replaced? These aren't secure and these aren't reliable, and we need better voting systems.
Mhm.
Paper is to paraphrase a friend of mine, paper is your friend.
Yeah, I like that. And of course, this being October, a cybersecurity awareness month, I think that message is very well, very well taken.
Right.
And Tim had a great question as well about, as you said, so much of this is distributed to local election officials across the country, and even here in Indiana. And the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research here has done some great work with the state of Indiana, and as well as the IU Cybersecurity Clinic, to encourage a lot of work on incident response planning and conducting tabletop exercises. I know there's been a lot of efforts along those lines across the country, but my sense is it's relatively fragmented. Was that also, part of the recommendations that you would suggest to have a more, cohesive approach to training, election officials across the country?
Oh yes, no, absolutely, and again that there be and there are in fact a number of recommendations and a discussion on this, specific recommendations in the report about training and how it could be done and stuff. Yeah, absolutely. But to again to have sort of uniform standards as to what counts as the kind of training you need and so on. That there be and some of this already exists, but there be, if you like, federal or at least state level certifications for what it is to actually be an election official or to work in voting booths and so on and so on. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it would be most unwise not to learn from experience and best practices elsewhere. As I said, I mean, though the system is extremely distributed at its best, there are some very sophisticated, very impressive operations out there. Among some of the precincts around the country.
One more kind of technical question, then we'll finish on a kind of an optimistic note. So Val was asking about using blockchain or biometrics for electronic voting systems. Regardless of the question, blockchain is the answer, right? So can you maybe enlighten us of why that might not be such a great idea?
Well, there's a section of the report that deals with blockchain that is a fairly strong statement against blockchain, about not using blockchain, and just pointing to the ways in which I mean blockchain was developed for distributed non-hierarchical solutions to problems, and this, although the election system itself is very distributed within a specific electorate, everything's centralized. You've got to bring all the votes together ultimately, and and it was felt that that it really added nothing. Now I don't regard myself, I mean, I understand it, but I don't regard myself by any means an expert here. Some of the people who do, let us say, were scathing about any validity that it might have in the voting context. So I, to some extent, referred to their critiques of blockchain as a solution here.
I love paper. I mean, that's a great note. And then lastly, again, at a bit of an optimistic note, since the U.S. was founded, detractors and critics have heralded our ultimate downfall. John Adams, once said, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There's never a democracy that did not commit suicide." But we're still sitting here 230 years later after a variety of threats, not only to our democracy, but to other democracies around the world that have stemmed from internal divisions fed by inequality, injustice, and racism. These are fissures that some foreign nations even are trying to widen, as we've just discussed. But we've always persevered. So I'm wondering, how hopeful are you after going through this process that we're still both able and willing to tackle these challenges?
Well, I'm also mindful that the Venetian Republic lasted 1,000 years, so republics can last for a long time. it kept changing to adapt itself to changing conditions. I'm moderately optimistic. I mean, I think there's a limit to how many fundamental attacks against the fundamental pillars of a democracy any democracy can take. But I think even what has transpired in the last 4 years in terms of just some of these fundamental issues of election security, although it's nowhere near sort of a the problems haven't been comprehensively addressed at all. People are aware of them and understand them. I mean, the fact that I think that there would be very few people who would advocate for a paperless solution anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I'm aware our committee was not the only committee or the only body around the country that's recommended that. Has been recommended over and over again by all kinds of bodies and so on. I think that's a very positive sign. I think the fact that that election security is getting much more attention at the federal level by DHS and others, I think is a very, very positive sign as well. I take even though one could argue about the pace of change, the fact that Indiana is, I think, has at least made the right decisions here. It might be helpful to speed them up, but I think that's a good sign. So you know, I'm pretty optimistic that we'll surmount these issues, but nor can you take it for granted that we'll be able to do that. It's going to take a lot of hard work by a lot of people to manage that.
Pragmatic optimism. I think that's as best as we can hope for 2020. Thank you so much. One more virtual round of applause, President McRobbie. We really, really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Yeah,
thank you. And of course, for everybody, don't forget to vote if you haven't already.
Don't forget to vote. Don't forget to vote. In fact, I think it's today the last day for submitting ballots by mail. I think, isn't it?
I think you're actually right.
Yeah, take advantage of all the opportunities you've got to vote. Yep.
That's it. Thank you so much, sir. And our next and final election security session is with Professor Duncan Hollis from Temple University on November 5th, which is co-sponsored with the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research. So thanks for joining us. Thanks again to Professor and President McRobbie for taking the time and for your leadership on this topic. And thanks again to all of you. Have a great rest of your afternoons. Don't forget to vote and be safe. Take care. Thanks again. Bye-bye.